Good afternoon, everybody. I think everything come to an end, and I hope this is an end to another chapter whereby all your efforts, and thank you for being with us all this time. All these efforts is going to be transmitted, hopefully, to the COP 27 in Sharm Sheikh. We will have the outcome will be on the web for this meeting at the university. But what we are going to do, I have with me Dr. Smail Swagdeen. We are going to cover the highlight of the outcome of this meeting, and then after that you could access this website, and then you can see a much more crisp point by point the recommendation which we are going to put there. The formulation of this meeting was to focus on the elements for adaptation. And the elements of adaptation is, by doing this, we are not denying the impact of mitigation. But the argument here that mitigation will take a long time to make a difference for humanity and for the people on this planet. Now we are more than 7.9 and fraction, means that we are 8 billion people on this planet. The 8 billion people will have a catastrophic impact from climate change. We're not going to talk about these details now, and therefore this webinar emphasizes issues related to adaptation, not disregarding mitigation, but we focus because this what is needed. The developing countries in Africa and the rest of the developing countries in Latin America and Asia, they are going to suffer most from climate change. And therefore, if you look at the population of the world, 14% only will live on the most industrial countries, and the rest out, which is the rest of the 100, they will be living on developing countries, and some of them, they will face acute poverty, acute hunger. When we looked at 10 years ago, we had the famous number of 840 million citizens of the world. They go hungry and they have malnutrition. And we worked very hard for years, international organization, to make a difference. And once this difference was made, now it's coming backward again. It's increasing now, it's approaching more than 900 and a fraction. To cut a long story short, this webinar has focused on elements of adaptation. What is the major elements which we had? We made an emphasis on the dynamic assessment of the impact of climate change on the ecosystem, and as well as we had a second element was how we can change the genetic resources to be tolerant to the increase of temperature. And the third one was identification of appropriate agro-management techniques which will help us to optimize water use efficiency, as well as optimize putting the fertilizers, putting the inputs of insecticides, etc. Therefore, all of this has to be optimized. All of this has to be more efficient with more precision. As well as the last element was enhancing the coping and the adaptive capacity, which cater for human and physical infrastructure. I don't want, and this session, we had session number 4, which Professor Lal has shared. And after that, we had 2 sessions, 2 panels with dignitaries and former prime ministers and former president of different countries. And Dr. Ismail Swagdeen has chaired this ably, and we came with a very precise conclusion. There was a lot of question which was being thrown out from the participant, not only you who are physically attending, but I thank all the participants who virtually has participated with us in this meeting. I will start now by asking Professor Ismail Swagdeen to give us an idea about the outcome of session 4.1 and 4.2, which is the 2 panels which he has really had wonderful input from it, as well as he will give us as well summary of what the great scholar Jeffrey Sachs has given us a very clear message of how he sees things. Then it's Jeffrey Sachs, and the 2 panels will hear from Dr. Ismail Swagdeen. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Adel. The issues that we had to address today were that we know, or at least we think we know pretty well, the problems of that climate change is causing around the world, and specifically to the poorer countries. And we do know also that these were the countries who contributed least to the climate change problem and who are suffering most the consequences of the issues that are arising from it. And so we brought Jeff Sachs, who after all is Mr. Sustainability at the UN, and he has been there for the Millennium Development Goals, for the Sustainable Development Goals. He runs the Sustainable Development Network and has been for 16 years now the advisor to the various Secretary Generals of the UN on sustainability issues. And he was kind enough to join us this morning. Jeff made really sort of 4 points. The first is that when we talk about adaptation and resilience, creating adaptation and resilience in the developing countries, this should be part of a broad program of investment in 6 specific areas. And he mentioned education, health, energy, sustainable land use, urban infrastructure, and the digital transformation of society. These are the 6 areas that this investment should go to. Now, how much investment do we need? Well, we need a lot more than the $100 billion that has been suggested. In fact, we come closer to $1 trillion, which, in fact, over a period of time, it would be $2 to $3 trillion, which is 2 to 3% of world output, and maybe 10% of world savings. So what we need is to mobilize this kind of money. And the way to do that is you set up a financing mechanism whereby you can use the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Bank to provide a core and use that to mobilize private capital rather than try to get it all funded by the governments. And provided that it is given as a loan to the developing countries, it has to be a very soft loan. So not 10 years at 10%, but rather like 30 years at maybe 2% interest. That would be more suitable. And besides, These are long-term problems that we are discussing, to build infrastructure, to transform things, etc. So that was first part of that. Secondly, we said that this transformation through the international financial institutions is particularly important because many of the poorest developing countries already have an excessive debt problem. And we saw that exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. And therefore, we need to find ways of reducing the debt crisis of the developing countries through financial means. And to make that work, what are the blockages? The blockages are primarily the United States and the West, who are resisting, let's say, the recognition that China is now the number 2 power in the world, and that therefore it has to play a big role in the refinancing and the restructuring of these institutions. But if we did that, then we would be able to have mechanisms by which we could provide funding, not just the 100 billion, but more than the 100 billion that has been talked about before. And we have to also think about something else, which came up in the other discussions, but nevertheless it's important. And that is many of the solutions that we are looking for are regional, not national. In a sense, we have 282 rivers that are shared by more than one country. We have power grids that are shared by more than one country, especially among the smaller countries in Africa. And therefore, there is a need to find ways of political cooperation that go beyond the responsibility of a single nation to its own people, but to a collaborative effort by those who can and those who need in order to benefit humanity. And this issue of how to deal with that, well, there was a suggestion that we could consider from Jeff, that we could consider compensation through a small national levy on carbon emissions and carbon footprints, and that this small levy could then be added up and handed over to a collective international body. And Dr. Amr Musa picked up on the compensation issue and said, you know, the ones who are suffering are those who are least responsible for that. And maybe there should even be a tribunal to deal with the people who are causing the problems and not willing to help with the solutions. A number of our other speakers, President Amina Gorib Fakim of Mauritius and Deputy Prime Minister Ekat Shikashvili of Georgia, pointed out that we need to bring all the stakeholders on board, but that ultimately it will be probably more effective to move to global issues through negotiations between blocs. So that if you have existing blocs like you do, for example, with the EU or the African Union, that then a negotiation between the blocs rather than all the countries involved, 27 in Europe and 54 in Africa, becomes very unwieldy. But 2 representatives from the blocs could come closer to a proposal, and that the proposals could then be endorsed by the membership of each of the blocs. And that's a good suggestion for a technique by which to arrive at these issues. Myself and others also raised the issue of incentives. How about the mobilization of private capital through incentives, whether a global carbon market or carbon taxes or carbon tariffs that would push people towards investing in the directions of renewable energies and circular economies and decarbonization. Whether we succeed or not remains to be seen, but certainly I think we need to think more effectively on that area. Then Prime Minister Zlatko Lagumzia said that Europe is now facing a major energy transformation that has been partially forced upon it by the problems in Ukraine, which resulted in Russia cutting off, Europe putting sanctions on Europe and the United States putting sanctions on Russia, and Russia cutting off gas supplies, energy supplies to Europe, which represents about 40% of what Europe consumes, and that this therefore requires a huge energy transformation in Europe, which may cost as much as $10 trillion. But there is a European Green Deal, and that they must think beyond the EU per se, towards a broader concept of Europe and its neighboring countries, and to think of that Green Deal and the energy transformation in a way that would benefit all of these, and at the same time, of course, significantly reduce the emissions. But at the same time, we do recognize that in the short term, there are some, shall we say, regressions in what the governments are doing, because they are using coal and fossil fuels to replace the gas that they used to have. And that would mean that the emissions would be higher for the same amount of energy. And we do need to also reflect on the fact that we are talking not just about adapting to existing practices or adapting to the existing technology. We want to transform that technology. And Maria Fernanda Spinoza said, for example, we are talking about economic production moving towards a circular economy. That is badly needed. But we must also recognize that the private sector alone will not do that, and that regulation and framework for activity to take care of market failures is important. And now, naturally, the UN would be the body to do that, but that the UN, after 75 years, needs reforms, and these reforms are essential. And Paul Revey of the Trilateral Commission mentioned the fact that we have to face up to the migration issue. Two things, he said. One is to recognize that we will have environmental refugees in addition to economic refugees, in addition to political refugees, and that this is going to put enormous pressure on everybody, but that this has to be factored in. And in a sense, that investments today in providing disaster risk reduction and facilitating adaptation and resilience would reduce the number of refugees that would be pressing against the entry into the West at one point or another. He also suggested that Europe involve research for clean technology, and Cyril Gaborucci, who was the Prime Minister of Moldova, said that we could do small steps in energy efficiency and to move to renewable energy and electrify transport, but that fundamentally we will need to involve everybody because the damage is going to be catastrophic. And I think we have been reminded of this week by the events in Pakistan, where over 30 million people have been displaced and over 1,300 people have died from a flash flood. And so we need the governments, the private sector, and society at large to create the system of resilience that is required. And the Sendai framework that was put together in 2015 would help to organize this kind of work. And Peter Roman, the former Prime Minister of Romania, said, we are talking about global decision-making, but global decision-making requires that we have the tools for that based on adequate foundations of understanding of how the interactions occur between these various aspects. And he gave the example of the Aral Sea. And of course, we were reminded of yesterday's wonderful session with Ratan Lal and Dr. Alia Rafa and others about how interconnectedness is essential to understand, and how, in fact, there is a new consciousness that is required, not just a new scientific understanding, but a new consciousness and awareness of the interlinkages of things. To which I have added myself that we are also witnessing an enormous effort to re-understand the impact of the water, and the not just in terms of scarcity and availability, or excessive rainfall and floods and drought, but also in terms of how the hydrological cycle that governs water is now interacting with the climate cycle and with the land use cycle, and that these discrepancies are leading towards a tipping point. And one or 2 points which we did not mention, but or maybe mentioned only in passing, is that we also need to look at sea level rise, which is turning out to be much faster than we expected. Expectations were that it would be 50 centimeters or a meter at most, but let's say 50 centimeters. Now it can be much, much more than that. The rate at which the ice is melting in Greenland and in Antarctica is very troublesome. And the rate at which it is not reforming in the glaciers of the mountains, whether of the Himalayas or the Andes or the Alps, is also very troubling. Just to give you a shocking number for you to think about, if all the ice in Greenland were to melt, the sea would rise by 6 meters. That's 2 floors, a building equal to 2 floors high. If the Antarctica also melts like Greenland, then you have a 7-story building. Can you imagine a 7-story building and think of all the cities that are next to the sea? What happens if the sea rises to 7 stories? And if all the glaciers were also to melt on the top of all the mountains, then we would have 21 floors, the equivalent of a building, 21 floors. Half of what the geography that we know would no longer exist, and many things would disappear. Now, the fact that people say, when is this 2,100? Oh, man, we're only 2022 right now. And another 80 years. ربنا كريم لا كريم انت بتتكلم. Well, I would remind you, we have been saying what's happening now. We have been predicting it in detail for 30 years. We started talking about it 50 years ago. 30 years ago, we started with IPCC and the reports, and now we are witnessing it happening. I mentioned Pakistan, but think of the forest fires, think of the heat waves, think of the droughts that are happening right now. Everything is happening right now. Yes, but if you go back to the reports we wrote back in 92 and 96 and so on, you would see that all of this was there. So we have to think about that as well. That's another one to think about. So, Dr. Adel, I think we have a number of items that you may want to consider in your submission.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ismail. You have gone through a lot of panoramic issues. But let us come back to the harsh reality. I am just going to go out just for a second. I was visiting the Agricultural Research Center in Nairobi, in Kenya, in one of my several visits there. And the director was putting a poster. And in this poster, he was putting a lion and a man and woman running in front of him. And the poster say, in Africa, when you get up early in the morning, you have to keep running, running, running. In Africa, every lion, when he gets up in the morning, he has to keep on running, running, running. Then he can eat his victim. And then, therefore, what we are having, what Dr. Ismail is not giving you doomsday scenario, but the scenario for the increase of water, of seawater rise is true. In Egypt here, we are going, as I mentioned in my presentation in the beginning, in the first day, that not only we are going to have sea rise only with 50 centimeters, but with 1 meter, we have 6 million to be displaced. They will go somewhere else, not in the first 35 kilometers from the delta. In addition to this, we will have seawater intrusion in the most fertile land of Egypt. And this salt intrusion could go beyond for another 25 or 30 kilometers in the delta. What will be left? And this is the most fertile strip of agricultural land for us. I'm just giving you an example. It's horrifying. With the RACC, which is a regional action for climate change, which is one of the major sponsors for this meeting, we looked at the first couple of years on the sea level rise, and there was a presentation which I was making for Africa. 250 port in Africa is going to be drowned. It's enormous. It will be disrupted. You have to build them again in another place with bays and different other locations physically. To cut a long story short, let me go back to the recommendation and precisely what we have been talking about in the different sessions. Let me start with a session which talk about dynamic assessment with simulation modeling using IoT, Internet of Things, using all sorts of tools in ICT-KM to make proper assessment for the change. Because the change with the increase of temperature, all agroecological zones are going to be shifted. And when they will shift with it the cropping pattern. Therefore, what you used to plant for years and years is not going to be any more viable. Therefore, we need this call from this meeting that we need to strengthen the modelers. We need to strengthen a team of people who are working internationally with the meteorological organization, World Meteorological Organization, as well as with the scholars from different universities and learning institutions everywhere in the world. In Africa, when I say we in Africa, we need to work to assess what will be the damage on the different local areas and regional areas. The IPCC scenarios from 1 to 6 now, it's all very high level. It talked about the global assessment for the impact. But there's very few studies which is made on regions, and very scanty and scattered studies for local. Therefore, if you go for a valley in a certain country and you say, what will happen to us in the valley? This what count for the inhabitants in this valley. What will happen to them if the temperature increase 3 to 4 degrees? They would like to know, and they have the right to know. It's not only they would like to know, but they have the right to know what catastrophe will hit them. And therefore they can preparedness and coping for this crisis can be really averted, or at least they can adapt to the wave of increase of temperature. Therefore, dynamic assessment for the agroecoregions in Africa is very important, and people has to put their hands together from different countries in Africa with international and regional organization. For instance, funds from the African Development Bank for this is highly needed. Then we move, because the question is how much every country will be committed to spend on this assessment. Without the assessment, you don't know what's next for you next day. And therefore, this is a conclusion from this group who talked. We had good presentations in this regard, but this is the outcome of it, that we have to work with each other to make this proper assessment. The second element was how can we dynamically change the cropping system. I'm not talking here about crops only, but it is for the livestock and for the fisheries. And we heard the presentations from scholars such as Dr. Osman, and he made clear that not only aquatic life in the ocean is going to be affected, but even aquaculture inland is going to be affected. And therefore, we need to see how we can avoid this. And by using different genetical makeup, different breeds, not only in goats, like Dr. Abunaga said, but in different breeds of suitability for these animals or for the plant, the crops to be planted. A lot of good papers is being presented to us using the most advanced tools of science, not only classic breeding, but this include gene editing and genomics to find a genetical makeup which could really be suitable for the changing agroecology. Parallel to this, and it has to go parallel, is the agro-management technique. Therefore, if I find a superior genetical makeup which will could grow and give us a good yield and a quality of product, and it will be suitable for the change of temperature, I need to find an agro-management technique which is suitable for it. And it means a more efficient irrigation system. The water use efficiency has to be very high, and this is another tool of adaptation. When we talk about carbon tax, developing countries can really submit proposal if they have a major program to modernize their irrigation system. They have to take this from the carbon tax hubs. And we need to train our young colleagues on how to do this. There is a center in New York. When Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen was in the World Bank as executive director there, I asked him that I am going to send to him 30 scholars, girls and boys to Washington to be trained on the business of carbon trade. And this is true for the whole of Africa. Because if you plant things, if you have carbon sequestration, or you minimize or optimize water use, you have the right to have carbon tax. And this is a very important issue, and he mentioned this in his presentation for us. Agro-management techniques will go for new mode of precision agriculture or agriculture 4.0, whereby everything will change to increase efficiency. It's an optimization process. Next to this was the issue of coping capacity and adaptive capacity. When you look at the map of coping capacity and adaptive capacity published by the IPCC, you'll find all the dry areas in either in pink or very heavy red color. That there is lack of coping capacity, there is lack of adaptive capacity. Therefore, the storm will come and everybody is not home. They are outside. And therefore, it will just struck them totally. And meanwhile, how to increase this? It's not only physical. It's not by building buildings. It's a human development. We need to focus on awareness for young children in the schools. We have to design program from kindergarten upward. And people has to be very careful in the education system to insert issues which relate to man and nature and how man and nature could live together. When you look at the pharaonic culture and you look at how they respect nature, there is some papyrus which would say somebody was defending himself in the day of judgment. He said, I never cut a tree, I never polluted the Nile, because this was sacred for them. And when I say we collectively, I think the tradition of different tribes in Africa as well as nations And our nomad here in Egypt, they know how to graze without hurting nature. They don't increase the carrying capacity. They don't cause rupture. And therefore, because the rupture means desertification, and it means exodus, and people has to leave. And therefore, the issue of carrying capacity, the issue of adaptive capacity and coping capacity is very important. This session did have the Minister of Agriculture of Jordan, who has very acute water poverty. It's 150 cubic meter of water per person per year. The world average is 7,000. The United States is 17,000 cubic meter per person per year. They had the luxury. But here in Africa, we don't have the luxury, except very small spots in the tropics. But if you go to, even Cape Town was running out of water under total drought and so on. I don't want to get into details, but this we should take care of, not physically, but as well as in this session, we had wonderful presentation from international and local civil society organization. Okay. She thinks that this is going somewhere else. But I hope that you are hearing me. I mean, this is just a tool. We don't want to be confused with tools. Anyhow, the session dealt as well with the human side of the coping capacity. And the human side is very important. And this is what Dr. Ismail hinges at, because we did have the Global Peace Initiative. Marianne was there, as well as a professor of psychology and Professor Alia Rafa from the School of Women School in Ain Shams University. They all talked about the shift of consciousness to know that we are all one and how we live with nature. And I talked to some of our colleagues here that even in our culture, we had the verses that hum khalqun mislakum. We are thinking that we are the only creatures on earth. I mean, there is a Nahl and Naml and all sorts of kingdoms. They have order. And the disorder comes from not respecting that there is order outside of the human order. And even human beings, when they get in disorder, they ruin themselves and they ruin the environment and nature around them. I think having said this, this is a very important element, because when you look at when we met in Montreal in 2017, there was a very interesting slide, which I put it in my presentation. It talked about race and vulnerability across people who are poor and the distance between the have and have not. And it comes to conclusion that the price of doing nothing is misery. And we should recognize this. And we had the opportunity, as has been said by Jeffrey Sachs this morning, that the next meeting will be here in Egypt, and after that, it will be in Indonesia. Then the developing country voice has to be heard, and this is our opportunity. I really, this is a message which we have to carry. I think there is a lot of information and so on, but I don't want to deal with it now. It will be on paper, it will be put for you. I would like just to end up this closing session by thanking first the local organizing committee, which was chaired by Professor Ayman Abu Khalid and all our colleagues who are present, Dr. Salah Suleiman. We'd like to thank him personally as a wonderful coordinator. He is a coordinator and activist, but dynamic activist for right cause. And he has the alam, all the colleagues who came, which I enjoyed talking to them from different parts in Africa. He really organized them for wonderful presentations, and we are hoping that some of this presentation we can take to Japan for the RACC and STS to present to our colleagues in this international meeting. Colleagues, as well as I would like to thank the colleagues in the International Organizing Committee. Of course, all of them, we thank them one by one, but special thanks to Dr. Mohan Saxena, he is the dynamo behind the International Dry Land Development Commission, and he is working very hard to see things going through. And until yesterday, very late at night, he was giving me signals for things, inputs, and so on. He does not stop, although he is now in Boston, but he kept on feeding things as well. And we thank Dr. Fatima Osman and all the colleagues who was there. Thanks to our colleagues who has helped in making this happen, Dr. Ashraf Badawi and his team, and the rest of the team from Ain Shams University. And as well as I would like to thank all the participants who participated with us, not only in the podium, in the theater here in Ain Shams, but virtually. Thank them for your patience with us. And the outcome is coming out of your collective effort here and there. Special thanks is due to to the president of University of Ain Shams, Professor Dr. Mahmoud Al-Mitani, who really has supported this idea from the beginning that we have the meeting in Ain Shams. He suggested even today to me that he would like to see this meeting repeated every year. Then we can have the same formula coming on every year. Maybe we can open it up and have other disciplines as well, because it's all under the same title. Colleagues, it's been a pleasure to have you and to work with you in this past 3 days. And we would like, we are graciously happy that we are in one of the very favorite and very renowned university in Egypt, Ain Shams University. The role of universities in this parade to overcome and to avert and to avoid and to enhance resilience, it has to come from centers of knowledge. Knowledge will be the base. Without the knowledge, we are not going to be there. And there is on that of creation of universities to transmit knowledge, to exchange knowledge, and to enhance the process of creating knowledge. Colleagues, I do thank you all for being with us, and by that I officially, on behalf of Professor Mitani, on behalf of all of you and the organizing committee, I close the meeting. Thank you.